Hello, everybody. Thanks so much to the organizers for the invitation. My name is Bzok. I lead a team at both McGill Faculty of Medicine and Neuroscience departments, as well as the Quebec AI Institute. That already explains what we're generally doing, which is to take large data sets with interesting, innovative data science technologies to revisit classic questions in science. And today, the topic is going to be mostly focused on large language models, because historically, we have seen a lot of increase of interest in the AI ecosystem since convolutional deep learning, roughly since 2010, 2012. And what we're currently witnessing, I think it's fair to say that we can view this as yet another wave of momentum in the AI ecosystems, thanks to large language models. So what started out to be as predicting the next word on the internet turned into phenomena of reasoning and of emergence, which even the developers of these kinds of systems didn't necessarily expect. So this is just a picture of our team, which is composed of technical people, computer scientists, engineers, and physicists, where we're trying to work closely with domain experts, as you'll see, to address exciting questions. And so, for the particular context of biomedicine now, which is particularly challenging, what types of requirements do we actually have for our machine learning platforms, for our data science platforms? The key surprise to many sometimes is that it's not just the excellence performance in classification tasks, in continuous outcome prediction tasks, as this is typically the case in a lot of areas where machine learning and deep learning are applied. A huge emphasis is actually on being able to say why a certain model is working and how it exactly gets to a particular decision point. So we want to introspect our models. Sometimes people say in a post-mortem biopsy kind of way, we want to unbox the black box. And it's not just this, what large language models are also very useful for is anything that's related to integrating information from multiple different sources. This could be another point to consider. So large language models are probably going to be useful for a lot of different areas in biomedicine, and that is because we have text data in all sorts of parts of our health provider systems, in health research. One instantiation is probably electronic health records. So there is all sorts of ways in which we could apply large language models in hospitals and hospital-derived kind of data. The big difference now is the limit of scale that has massively decreased. So why have we been doing so much better in terms of scale since very recently? And I would argue that it's the particular kind in which large language models are actually trained, which is the semi-supervised way. So classically, we really needed careful, often very laborious and slow annotation of all the various data points that we bring to bear in our training data. But that has really changed with transformers since 2017 and since the language models, because now we can really train one of those systems on almost the entirety of the internet based on normative assumptions that's around 2 trillion tokens. And we do not need to provide any supervisory guidance to these learning systems. They simply learn intrinsic structure in a way that we do not fully understand, which then leads to all kinds of emergent properties. So the quick definition, the working definition that I'm going to go here by for transfer learning is going to be we try to extract intrinsic structure from a larger amount of data to then transition, carry over a particular learning solution to another area, typically more poor in data, to derive advantages. So you will see this can take all sorts of forms, but it takes special relevance in neuroscience and medicine because despite the big data movement, I think it's fair to say that a lot of areas in neuroscience, a lot of areas of biomedicine, we do not have the amount of data that we would like, or I would personally argue, we do not have the amount of data that we would actually need to answer the kinds of questions that we have in a satisfying way. So, and the big question is now, how can we use general purpose data that's out there that has maybe nothing to do with a particular task in neuroscience or biomedicine to carry over this intrinsic structure, this average internet mind, this extracted semantic world knowledge that the large language model has extracted to a downstream task for our advantage. We have seen an emergence of a large series of scaling studies how these transfer learning phenomena actually occur. The basic economics of model training has for a long time been that the larger you make the models, the better the work. Or more specifically, here I see we see a small plot from the Kaplan 2020 paper. And this really investigated three main parameters, the model size in terms of parameters, the data size, as well as the amount of compute budget that we have. What they found is you do avoid overfitting. You do keep learning interesting, coherent structure as you increase the data and the number of parameters to the model size at the same time. So, and surprisingly, despite their monstrosity, large language models really turn out to be highly data efficient. So we can typically comfortably train on 2 to 20 times more tokens than we have parameters in a model. So that is what I call data efficient here at this point. So of course there are recent other developments. We learned at just Neurops last year that maybe this is a function of metrics. Perhaps we had emergent phenomena already before the current era of large language models, or maybe there aren't even real emergence phenomena or reasoning and understanding of these systems, if you will. And paradoxically, we observe that now large language models keep getting always smaller again. So the recent realization really seems to be that we do not necessarily need always larger, always higher parameter values. If we have always more higher quality data, perhaps that's actually enough to really learn high quality large language model systems. So let's motivate why it's actually so difficult once we have a working large language model system to make sense of why it's exactly working. So probably a lot of you have seen these kinds of representations, symbolic schematics. And we have essentially 3 steps. The first one being the input embedding. So different from other machine learning systems, we really need tokens, we really need bag of words kind of input representations, which don't need to be text. It actually works with sequences in general, which makes large language models, of course, interesting for all kind of biological sequences, such as DNA sequences, protein sequences, or transcripts in cells, for example. So the first stage is we derive an embedding, so a real value vector for text sequences in our input data. So that is still fairly straightforward, but really starts to get much more complicated the moment we get to the attention part of a transformer layer. So this can be presented in all sorts of ways. I just want to point your attention to the fact that the transformer is really a series of linear operations. So it's not necessarily the part that is most difficult to introspect. So and that makes it a natural starting point for any agenda of making sense of how large language models, quote unquote, reason. So as the first approximation, you can think that what is the A matrix here? The confluence of the Q and K systems, the queries and the keys, is that this very much pertains to how information flows from a source token to a target token. And it is the O and the B matrices instead that are really about controlling which kinds of information are actually transferred between this source and target tokens. So that is just one way of simplifying a little bit how we think about the attention layer of a transformer block. Or said yet a little bit different, you can think of it as a QK circuit, as some call it here. And that is because the K and the Q matrices almost act together, and in the same vein, the output value for the circuit in turn also acts in concert. So why don't we think of them as conjoint operations to hopefully make progress towards mechanistic interpretability? So yet another time, all of these, as you can see here from a linear algebra perspective, are linear operations. However, even just these attention circuits, it has been quite difficult to make progress understanding them. So I already mentioned most of these points, and that is despite the fact that the last part of the transformer book, the NLP, the multilayer perceptron part of it, the fully connected forward neural network, it's even more penetrable. This part usually makes up roughly 2/3 of the overall parameters of a large language model. And we know from the deep learning literature before large language models that it is quite difficult to really decipher, disentangle the meaning, the concepts, the unique aspects that are encoded, transported, represented through these nonlinear layers. So overall, we have several of those in a block. A series of those typically, and that makes it even more challenging because the embeddings that we learn in the first transformer layer, they may actually they trickle down with their attention emphasis to the next layer, and so on and so forth. So this stands in contrast to how we tried to operate with the last generation natural language processing systems. So I'm thinking of Bzok, Word2Vec, which emerged after 2010. There we had a big emphasis on so-called semantic embeddings, or semantic embedding factors. So a notion, a meaning of a word typically, as you see here on the bottom of the slide, the form that it took typically is that you represent them not as a string, but as a real-valued vector in a high-dimensional semantic coordinate system, where the position in this multi-dimensional coordinate system denotes the meaning. And that then in turn means that we can actually do semantic vector operations once we have continuous vector spaces, which already hints at the universality of spanning semantic spaces in general. We can actually go and compute what semantic embedding vectors are how similar to each other or how distant from each other. And this allows us to do all sorts of interesting downstream operations. However, this way of thinking is less prominent in the large language model literature at this point from my reading of the literature. So as you can see, there's all sorts of operations. We can reframe, reconsider parts of the system in all sorts of ways. And I hope I've provided a few examples of what form this can take. So back to the NLP layer, where we have the actual nonlinear processing operations. Part of the reason why this is so challenging is what's called polysemanticity. So we do not necessarily have clean neuron interpretations. A single neuron in the NLP does not necessarily correspond to a single concept or a single notion as we would like that are directly accessible to us humans. That's empirically not been the case. And so we end up with a compressed representation of what is potentially a way of encoding more concepts or high-level features, as some people call it. Then you have hidden dimensions in the NLP part. So it may be possible to reverse this compression, and there are ways to do this, for example, based on sparse over complete dictionary learning, where you try to unpack hundreds and hundreds, potentially thousands of underlying features or concepts that NLP layers are representing, which you would not guess was just looking at the activations of the hidden neural network layer. Yet another way of thinking about it is perhaps there are so-called privileged bases into which we can rotate the hidden layer activations such that the axes of our new coordinate system into which we draw our NLP activations may much more naturally align with concepts and notions that are accessible to us humans. So one strategy to make progress in large language models, which have been tried and showed some initial progress, would be re-expressing the high-dimensional activations in the NLP into another space. But the question is, how do you actually find these other spaces? However, if we can do this, we could overcome the curse of dimensionality, which is also a problem because for the investigator, it is typically a challenge to just even visualize the intermediate processing or modeling products that emerge as we look at information, how it flows through the system. So it's not just that, it's also quantitatively measuring interpretability has been difficult to automatize. So that means it is difficult, it requires human intervention, and it's slow. And so it would be great if we could come up with metrics that allow us to just approximate the degree to which we can generate human interpretable representations for what is going on in the NLP layers of LLMs. So this takes me to why we are exactly using LLMs in our particular project that I want to talk to you today, and that is autism. So, second part of the story, autism is a part of psychiatry. And as a lot of people notice very quick, is a very special discipline inside of medicine because we do not really necessarily have hard currency markers to detect whether a certain child, a certain individual with a suspicion of autism actually does carry this diagnosis or not. We cannot draw blood, and we don't have any other established trusted biomarkers that we could use to really be sure. So what happens is you really need people trained after medical school for years and years and years to specialize in finding out in encountering, when they encounter somebody, okay, does that individual in front of me meet the criteria for the diagnosis of autism or not? And just the definition of autism, to make things worse, has been a moving target. So autism as a concept probably emerged around 1900, and it initially described a particularly strong disinterest in reality. So it started to be described as patients, individuals who tend to be in their own heads a lot, if you will. However, the definition of autism changed a couple of times. And so, for example, in the 60s and 70s, it was changed yet another time. There was a much bigger emphasis on deficits in social interaction, which were not directly emphasized as such since the beginning of this research area. And there was not this big emphasis on ignoring reality anymore. So, however, what's important for this talk is that it's roughly for more than 50 years that in clinical practice and in research, we see a strong emphasis on deficits in social interaction, that these clinicians trained for years take a strong indicator that a certain individual probably meets the criteria for autism. Because a big question that is also lurking here is that of specificity. We are oftentimes not sure how to exactly come up with a criteria or combinations of criteria to define a diagnosis of autism, where subsets of these criteria do not also qualify for other candidate mental health conditions. So the debate of specificity has been a long and vexing one, and we have not really converged on a particular interpretation or truth or consensus, but maybe we should really keep working on it, because autism is a very widespread condition. So more than 1% in our societies probably meet the criteria for autism. And that, of course, leads to needs in society that we need to meet to help these individuals. So nevertheless, at this point in time, the clinical judgment, the clinician talking to the patients, is still the best and perhaps the only way to certify this particular diagnostic label. How does this exactly work? So that's maybe clear to some of you, but perhaps not to everybody. We have diagnostic manuals which codify the criteria and the explanations of how diagnoses like autism should be done. And those are shared across the hospitals, across healthcare institutions. And this is really how medical doctors also communicate with each other, how they have actually come to the conclusion through talking to their patients, often several times, not just in a single session. So it is very much based on lists of criteria that are laid down in these agreed upon incumbent diagnostic manuals, an important one of which is called DSM-5. So let me kind of explain a little bit the broader context as well. So over the last decades, we have seen a lot of improvements in what you can call high throughput biology. And of course, once we had these new technologies, a lot of people thought, okay, let's revisit autism this time with all this information, with this depth. And we should be able to make a difference in autism and identify reliable markers of disease that would allow us to automatically detect autism. So one of those high throughput technologies that emerged and that became widely available and cheap, less than $50 per subject, is common variant genetics or genome-wide association studies. However, these genome-wide association studies, they only led to explaining a few percent, around 2% of the observed variants in the autism phenotype. Or if you use this to perform automatic classification, we probably cannot very much exceed 70% of classification accuracy of whether or not somebody carries this diagnosis or not. We, from a different perspective, we did not find autism-specific genes using genome-wide association studies so far. So another high-throughput technology that investigators in biomedicine have certainly used is brain imaging using magnetic resonance imaging, MRI. And there's all sorts of flavors of resting state, the so-called, of MRI imaging. One modality, resting state imaging, is particularly well liked among them. But even teams, very professional machine learning, with years of experience in doing high throughput brain imaging and very carefully conducted data science workflows, they could not get much beyond 65% accuracy in classifying whose brain scan belongs to somebody who is neurotypical and whose brain scan belongs to somebody who carries a diagnosis of autism. So this is the reason why still today, even after decades of research in these areas with large data sets from primary biology, we have not really found a way to circumvent clinical judgment as the main means to diagnose these individuals. So what's going to be important for the motivation of this project is that we take a drastically different approach. Given the lack of progress in biological approaches, especially GWAS and brain imaging, we try to take a different route. And we just go back and recognize a human individual talking to the patient is still the best case, the optimal scenario to come to reliable diagnosis. So why don't we apply machine learning to the diagnostic process itself? So can't we machine learn using large language models the clinical decision-making process of how a healthcare professional is exactly reasoning about whether the person in front of them should carry the diagnosis of autism or not, to revisit also the question of autism-specific traits. So we don't do this in isolation. As I alluded to at the beginning, our tendency is to partner with domain experts in a particular project. So here in this case, we work with Emile Gabot and Laurent from the University of Montreal, seasoned psychiatrists who have been seeing hundreds of patients. So the hospital where we draw the data from actually sees more than 100 patients per year. So that's 1 out of 3 days, there's a new patient with autism. And so it's fair to say that they have certainly seen a huge variety of clinical cases in this area. So they helped us through the process. And the particular input data that we used for our LLM project here is the actual reports of the clinicians that they put into the system every time they see a particular patient. As I mentioned before, it's not usually possible to come to a definitive conclusion of whether or not somebody carries diagnosis of autism just based on a single session. So we actually only used the text manifestations of how the clinicians document for themselves and for others what exactly happened when they met a certain potential patient. So we have more than 4,000 of those reports. This is from more than 1,000 patients. Each patient is showing up several times. And typically the clinicians really need 3, 4, or 6, even 6 sessions to really be sure and come to a diagnosis based on the clinical symptoms that they have observed. So this is what they write down. We digitize, anonymize this. We use OCR to turn the analog information into digitized information. We had to do a number of cleaning steps to then finally design our large language modeling architecture, which builds on a pre-trained LLM. This is what I alluded to at the beginning, that has already been trained on hundreds and thousands of text sources that by themselves do not necessarily have much to do with psychiatry or neuroscience or any other aspects of what we are trying to do. The magic is that we have learned a general semantic representation, a quote-unquote a world model, if you will, that we now bring to bear in this clinical data set by fine-tuning it on the reports that we actually observed. So you will see that we add a specialized attention mechanism on top of it, but I'll get to this at a later stage. What's important to realize here at this point already is that we do not have a lot, quote unquote, data. We have thousands of reports, which are maybe 1 or 2 word pages long each, which by machine learning standards can certainly not be judged to be a massive data set. However, this amount of data is actually already enough. I mentioned that LLMs are quite data efficient, sample efficient. And this is really what we can confirm, because fine-tuning on this very small set of reports allowed us to outperform a series of baseline classification models. So that means we take the text information that we have in the reports, typically by a backup words representation, so only counting in a sort of histogram how many times does a certain word occur in each of the text reports, actually losing the sequence structure. However, using simple classifiers, we only got to 65%, which actually in fact is already as high as what brain imaging is able to do. Then we tried classifiers with higher order linearity, that's random forests. Also based on the backup voice representation, we get another almost 10% of gain. And last generation natural language process model, Bzok to back, that's a word to back variant. We also did not really get past 75%. However, after fine-tuning on these reports, we can see that we are almost indistinguishable from 80% accuracy. So that then already means we can build a model, although it has millions of parameters, we can make it work on a small subset of reports, which is common in the medical community. We could not train this model from scratch just based on these data. We really need this internet scale pre-training step. However, then we can show that we can outperform a series of standard modeling choices. So I'm not going to hide a number of steps that we tried to take, which did not lead us to make progress in interpretability of why this large language model did perform so well, or how it exactly comes to the conclusion of using elements of the clinician's documented reports to reach accurate classification results, of which report in the end belong to an individual who actually does carry the diagnosis of autism or only was suspected to carry this diagnosis. For example, we started off, like many, of course, at the word level. In the attention layer, this gives us attention matrices that have the size of vocabulary size on both edges. And as you can imagine, this is pretty difficult to work with, to visualize. Nevertheless, we tried, for example, decomposing the space with supervised and unsupervised techniques. This did not really lead, in our experience, to clear progress in making sense of what exactly is coherent in the attention scores at the word level across hundreds and hundreds of reports and in telling the patient groups apart. We also tried to perform positive-only versions of PCA to the attention scores of the hundreds of reports. Same observation. We got a lot of results, but we didn't really get clarity on how exactly the large language model is taking its decision. We also tried graph analysis, network analyses, because we were thinking that the word level representations, they are naturally occurring in semantic webs where words are more or less close to each other. And perhaps we can represent this information in a directed acyclic graph and use the arsenal of graph theory tools to come to a more useful representation of what is going on in the internals of the model. This did not really lead to a lot of progress either. Similar but different, we also tried nearest neighbor analysis. So we identified highly attended words that the attention had flagged, such as language or behavior, and then we tried to find their closest neighbors in the semantic space. You see some examples here, but we made the same experience. We had a lot of data, but not necessarily better conclusions on what is going on in the model. So there's all sorts of explanations that we could now make. However, I'm just going to summarize it this way by saying perhaps we're not studying this phenomenon at the right unit of investigation. So maybe we need to change the unit of inference, the unit in which we are trying to make sense from these high-dimensional results. So this is where we had the idea. Why don't we go back to the earlier insights in the NLP community, which is working with semantic embedding vectors. So every word can be represented as a real value vector, but by aggregating words in a certain sentence, in a certain report, we can actually build a sentence level representation. And so we changed our approach and tried to go all in on the idea of building a specialized attention mechanism that actually provides more direct interpretability by acting at the single sentence level. And as you will see, that's not the only way in which we can draw advantages. It actually has a whole series of advantages. So just to kind of recap, because this is one of the most commonly asked questions here for this project, we naturally obtain semantic embedding representations. You have 300-dimensional semantic space, you get 300 real values that represent where in the semantic system of the LLM, from the pre-training and fine-tuning, how exactly it instantiates the meaning. But we can meet pool across those to get a sentence level representation, which then in turn could be fed into a classifier to tell them apart. This is exactly what we did. So we extended the usual pre-trained LLM framework that we started with, and we plugged in an interpretability module, which is the red one here on the right, a single head attention one, which operates in sentence units. So which then in turn is fed to the classifier, which achieves the reports. So the first question would be, what this large language model is learning? Is that actually related to the classification, or is the large language model just learning quote-unquote random things? So what we see here is the combined NLP layers, the activations from this system were submitted to principal component analysis. So which means that now being at the sentence level, each dot in this low-rank embedding representation that you can see here corresponds to a particular sentence. we performed coloring in this 2D space of the most explanatory dimensions as a function of the known diagnosis. But the diagnosis here in red and blue did not really influence the fitting of the PCA model itself. So what you can see is that in blue, the autism cases, which were later confirmed to actually be the genuine case of autism by the healthcare professionals and medical doctors, they actually do cluster in a particular subspace of this plot, which is at the bottom right. Mostly is distinguished by the most explanatory direction of variation in the data. So this already shows that we can, for fact, learn an autism-aware semantic space. So whatever it is, what the large language model is doing, it has a close relationship to the outcome that we actually care about. And if you look at the dots, there's some overlap, but it's not, doesn't seem to be too much overlap. So how can we try to dissect this even a little bit further? One way, the classic way, is so-called surrogate models. They do not try to recapitulate the exact mechanics of the model fitting that happens in the actual model. We consider here that this may just be too complicated. Instead, we use a simpler, more interpretive model, in this case just a linear model, to mimic the predictions that the actual model, the large language model, is doing. So even if the large language model is wrong in certain unseen reports, we will fit the linear model to actually mimic this behavior. So what we see is that we can fit layer-wise prediction models for each of 12 different layers of the overall large language model. And we see even in the earliest layer that we get around 0.75 area under curve performance. So already at the earliest stages of this model, we can discriminate the patients at a fairly high rate. And it gets better and better with every layer, with the 12th layer reaching performance up to 0.96 area under the curve. So having a deeper model is an important conclusion here. For effect actually does lead to better prediction performance. We want to have a nested multi-layer LLM to really extract as much information as we can. And what's coming out of this 12th layer is then actually the input for, as you saw, for our specialized attention work. So here's an example of the attention scores, what it looks like in one particular report, because as you know, you get a different attention score matrix for every input observation. So this is why you see here example reports in each of these three plots. Notice that we do not have words on the axis anymore. This is what this usually looks like, because this is the result of our specialized attention module, where we now can see how does the large language model actually assign relevance, not to single sentences even, but to combinations of sentences. How does the large language model actually more or less look at the reports in this particular case, with all the sentences that make up one particular report, to come to the conclusion whether or not this report belongs to somebody with autism or just was suspected with autism, but it was ruled out. So I will just quickly mention that we do indeed see all sorts of words and notions and concepts in the sentences that are flagged here in the blue cubes that have high relevance to what is discussed in the clinical field and among these clinicians as relevant aspects in coming to a conclusion about this diagnosis. So we use these highly attended sentences to go further and map out some of the most relevant words. So let me just emphasize again, those are not word level analyses. The trick from our project is that we re-represent everything as a sentence notion. However, once we know the most intended sentence for each of the reports, we can actually go and carry out descriptive statistics on the ratios for a certain word of most attended highlighted words between who ended up to carry the diagnosis and who didn't. And you see that here at the top of the list, words, letters, flapping, that's the motor movement, and fingers. There are the three top discriminators that occurred up to 20 and more times more often than the most attended sentences in the reports of the autism patients compared to the suspected autism cases. So there's all sorts of ways in which we can now look into the machinery, what's going on. The common question for scientists is probably, how do you validate those results further? How can we know that what you find there is actually real and not just artifacts of carefully conducted data set exercise? So this is where Jack and me came up with the idea of performing an external validation in the following way. So the machine learning community tends to try to really solve model interpretability, in my opinion, in a somewhat isolation of everything else that exists. What we thought is that maybe in this particular application domain, there is a way to integrate already existing knowledge that is not part of our input-output mapping function of a fine-tuned LLM, but they can actually provide us insight into what it is what the model is learning. So I mentioned before, the DSM-5 diagnostic manuals, that's the catalog. This is the enshrined description system that clinicians are using every day on the planet to really diagnose these people. So wouldn't it be great if we can relate the DSM items, which were not actually measured by themselves in any of these patients? How can we actually bring this in contact with what is going on in the internals in our LLM? So, but briefly, what's important for the interpretation is that we have two big clusters in the DSM system for the diagnosis of autism. And the most important take-home message is that the A section has this classical strong focus on social impairments, which has a big emphasis on how we study, diagnose, and treat autism until today. Whereas this B section also contributes to the diagnosis, but has a much weaker emphasis. So first off, we tried to quantify in this semantic vector embedding operations sort of way verbal descriptions of each of the established DSM criteria that I just mentioned. How do they actually relate to our autism-aware semantic space? What we see is we can actually map them into the sentences. Again, one dot being one sentence in our reports. We find that it's actually the B criteria. So the section that's not social behavior related, it's those that are in the subspace in blue, which is actually leading to the diagnosis squad. So it is not the case that what is currently most emphasized, the social impairment indicators, which is A1, 2, and 3, those ones are actually at the opposite end of the physical component 1. The way we quantify the relationship of DSM-5 criteria and semantic embeddings was cosine similarity. So of course, cosine similarity has been used before in NLP to quantify the similarity of semantic representations. But the point is here that we could not necessarily have done this at the word level, the way in which these LLMs are typically used in medical space, in neuroscience, and beyond. So yet another way to look at this is that we can actually now take each of the 7 DSM criteria. We revisit the semantic embeddings of the leading sentences, the most discriminatory, the most attention receiving sentences in each of the reports. And we can now quantify how similar is it in meaning to the known 7 DSM criteria. And let me just say again, the trick is really that the DSM criteria have never been measured in these patients or in these clinical settings. However, we found a way to introduce them into our modeling pipeline so that we can perform an acid test against established knowledge. So a value of 1 is very similar in semantic meaning, 0 is there's no relationship, minus 1 would be opposite meaning. So we did this for the most attended sentences in both cases, the autism and non-autism groups. And as you can see, again, we have the criterion B1, B3, B4, the non-social criteria, which are actually most similar to the autism diagnosis. We do not find that our leading sentences that are most useful for autism diagnosis, that those are actually very semantically similar to the healthy group. We confirmed these results using latent discriminant analysis. So we actually re-represented each report just as these 7 similarities of leading sentence with established 7 DSM criteria. So we only had 7 numbers instead of the whole semantics of the reports that we initially had. And we could reach pretty high prediction accuracies in the answer reports of around 0.98 area under the curve. So this shows that our large language model actually looking at from different perspectives and with all sorts of ways to try to peek into what our refined autism-aware large language model is doing. It's not at the word level, but at the sentence level, not at the neuron level. But I would claim that we found a number of interesting ways to sneak peek into it. And the core conclusion is that we cannot confirm this 50-year-old idea that there is a very strong emphasis on social deficits in what is the most important in coming to an accurate autism diagnosis, based on the data that we analyze. So instead, it really turns out that it is stereotyped repetitive behaviors, special interest, and sensory behaviors that appear to be much more discriminatory, at least in how the large language model attends to the semantic units that we find in text reports from clinicians on the actual settings where they come to these conclusions. And that could mean that maybe we have to readjust some of these gold standard manuals, such as the DSM-5. There's all sorts of ways in which we could take this to the next level. One way would be to, I alluded to it, deconvolve now the NLP activations of our fine-tuned LLM even further. We saw from the PCA space that there is certainly structure that is closely related to the diagnosis. However, we could use further decomposition techniques, especially sparse over complete dictionary learning, to try to see, are there really perhaps thousands and thousands concepts or features that are actually instantiated in the NLP parts of our LLMs that contribute to the successful diagnosis. We could also perform all sorts of follow-up analyses on the attention head ablation studies, if we have multi-head systems, we can perform all sorts of modifications of pre-output layer activations and so on and so forth, what sometimes is described as counterfactual analysis. And both of these ways that I just mentioned, so finding privilege basis 1 and forms of ablation studies 2, we could also look at this from the context of optimization. So as a function of training epochs, looking for jumps or non-smooth transitions from one training iteration to the next one. So the interpretability takeaways is it's not just about prediction accuracy for biomedicine and neuroscience. We are one of these areas where it is extremely important to come to a conclusion also about how exactly did the system come to its prediction. From a larger perspective, this is of course extremely relevant for the AI safety debates. So any progress in the LLM explainability realm probably translates to benefits in the AI safety problems as well. And I hope I convinced you that sometimes it helps to simply re-express the problem, rotate the problem into a different space, recast what we're actually trying to find, to make specialized versions of our architectures that actually have all sorts of downstream benefits. And I hope I convinced you that we did use external information to really validate what we have found, and the internals of our LLMs did align with established diagnostic criteria, and we could automatize these comparisons at scale without human intervention, which, as I mentioned at the beginning, is one of the weaknesses of this whole LLM explainability field at this point. So finally, some product placement. If you're interested in these kinds of reflections, feel free to check out our recent paper. With this, I thank you so much for your attention, and I thank the organizers for inviting me.
I can't say thank you to Danilo, but I will say thank you to Jack. There are some questions already in the discussion.
I use this one?
Yeah, I use it. But I'll ask one, because I have a feeling that you hear this one a lot, or you will hear this one a lot. If you were not studying autism, but brain imaging, clearly you wouldn't say, I want to hear what clinicians say about these images. You want to use the images as the data. Is there any possibility of that in the autism study? Well, and by the way, it's the same, if you were here in the morning, it's the same thing as what Friedemann said about cross-validation with real brain data.
Yeah, well, I think, is this microphone working?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think, are you sort of getting at the aspect of, using multimodal information, using all?
Yes, it's grounding.
Text, yeah.
I'm
So I
always
think,
asking about grounding.
yeah, for sure. I think that would be, we actually had a few questions about this before, of using things like brain imaging and also sort of other biomarkers in conjunction with the text information to get more robust sort of predictions and interpretations. And I think, yeah, I think that'd be really useful. It's just we don't quite have the data set to do that at this point. But I think if we want to collect that kind of data set, I think it would be super helpful in this context.
Okay, here's some of the questions that came in. Everybody here is welcome to ask questions. Everybody out in the two other lands, the attendees and the panelists as well.
So should I read the question?
Yeah.
Okay. So the first one here is, could sentence level representation be performed on verbal production of the child rather than the interpretation of the clinician? And could this help further focus on that, which are stereotypical utterances or lack of neurotypical utterances? Yeah, so this is also another question that we get frequently is, so we're training on the clinician observations directly, whereas maybe we could actually train on the actual speech patterns of the child or the individual.
Same question I asked you.
Yeah, and I think that would be, again, we don't have the data for that at this point, but I think that would be super helpful to maybe even integrate those two things. And I think that would probably give us even better favorability and performance for sure. Yeah, maybe I should go to the room next, or
If they, yes, go ahead. No, why, could you come up here? No, stay here so she can get her face on.
I was thinking about the like
Wow.
they were talking about like using the child's speech patterns to diagnose autism. I was just thinking about like eye movement and eye contact. That would be like you could track it. Like you could have a let's say computer vision model to like you could have like frames of the video that you could analyze with the model computer vision model to accurately track the eye movement.
yeah, no, that's another suggestion that we got for sure is incorporating eye tracking, because I think that from what I understand, I'm not totally familiar with it, but from what I understand, there's a decent amount of data available on eye tracking in autism. So it would be very interesting to incorporate that as well. So maybe just going back to the line question here. So the same commenter asked, but a single sentence.
Not necessarily the same one, when it's unidentified and it's.
Okay. Well, they asked that the single sentence slide seems to mirror content analysis based on ADOS and the ADR assessment variables. Could we not train on data analysis directly from these scoring tools? Yes, again, that would be that's something that we're looking at as well, because we do have the data for that. But it's just trying to incorporate it into our pipeline. We couldn't make it work exactly, but and also there's a lot of missing data in that analysis, but we definitely like to do that as well.
Another one.
Sure. So I think one of these ones. So the next question here is, are there any models working on the diagnosis of ASD with adults who have acquired some compensation skills with regards to social skills? Although nonverbal assessment of section A, the ADOS module 4 questions tend to flesh these out. Yeah, so this is a good question. So the demographic that we were working with mostly was children. So I think there's a median age of around 5. So this is really the data that we have is coming from children, but again, there's sort of another aspect of diagnosing adults with autism, which carries with it a different sort of set of questions and things that clinicians look for. So yeah, I mean, again, we don't have the data set for that, but it would be very interesting to look at that as well, for sure. I guess I'll go into another question online here.
Read it really slowly and enunciate.
Okay.
They can't see it.
Okay. I am mirroring Stephen's question when asking if we could not use ADOS / the ADR directly. So the gay studies are becoming relevant. Yeah, and again, that's something that we would definitely like to work with if we have the data paired with the clinician observations as well. So this is really, interestingly, this is one of the first data sets that we've come across. This is a proprietary data set that we've collected in Montreal. So there just isn't a lot of now, the thing is, of course, there's tons of health records available that we could mine potentially if we get access to that. But this is sort of a preliminary investigation into using these clinical observations. So this last question online here is, does the model's accuracy vary as per the functioning of the patient? So how does the model fare with high functioning individuals? So that's a really good question. We actually didn't look at that. It's sort of hard to assess, which individuals are high functioning and which ones. So the data that we got, we didn't exactly have, a direct variable for that. But I guess, we could go back and look at the reports and sort of potentially put them on a scale of, high functioning to low functioning instead of just giving a binary prediction. So that could be an interesting avenue to explore. But yeah, that would be interesting to know if the model itself finds it fair. I would imagine that yes, that is something that's hard to it's hard for the model to disentangle if the individual is very high functioning in many areas. There are less signals in the text that actually point to autism, whereas sort of the lower functioning ones, it's much more concrete. They have trouble with speech. They have very obvious repetitive movements or tics. So that's much easier to pick up, obviously.
We're in academia and half of the room is Asperger's, so.
Well. Yeah, I mean, so I will say these individuals that we studied were would be more on the I guess lesser functioning side, just because they were referred to a specialty autism clinic just to get, you know, a more formal diagnosis. So obviously, if there was, you know, a lot of doubt, then we probably would not have them in our.
We take care of our own, we don't send them to clinics.
Okay.
Other questions? From here, from there? If not, I have a last question for you. You could speak of LLM research as hearsay research, because words are words, and all you're getting is hearsay. It's said this and people said that, and they said the same word with that word. So if we call that hearsay research, you're actually working on another hearsay body. And the question is, isn't it time to also, for example, when you're looking for other medical records, instead of autism, where maybe there are not many direct measures for autism, but if you went into cardiology, you'd surely have a lot more data to use than just what the clinicians say about their data.
No, you're definitely right. I think the idea of grounding is very important in the medical domain for sure. And again, we just wanted to tackle something where LLMs are immediately applicable, which is autism, because there's simply nothing else we can use really, other than the clinician judgment and the clinician observations that are
Oh, hearsay.
exactly. So we wanted to actually directly look at that hearsay and say, you know, what are the aspects of this hearsay that lead them to diagnose?
No, it's a terrific study. I think. In fact, it's time for us to applaud you for both the study and for your. Thanks. Oh, cool.